Hi everyone, welcome to my talk on the principles of sustainable software engineering. My name's Asim Hussain. If you see a jaw ache somewhere on the internet, it's probably me. I usually hang out on Twitter, but if you see a jaw ache anywhere, it's probably me. I blog about various things on my website, asim.dev, and I'm what's called a green cloud advocacy lead at Microsoft, which is a fairly new role, and I'll go into that later on. It's my son Micah. Something about this photo makes me think that he loves his daddy. But some really great advice that I got from a friend of mine when he was first born was ask him, take the nappy changes. My wife's breastfeeding, so he was like, she's going to be breastfeeding him all the time, and for the rest of the time, he's just going to get passed around like a football amongst all the relatives and everything else that's going to be going along. So whenever there's an opportunity for a nappy change, go take it, and that'll be you and his personal time. And I was like, damn right, let's do it. I'll take the nappy changes. So I told my wife, and she was more than happy for me to take all the nappy changes. She was like, yeah, brilliant, go for it. Then a couple of days later, she goes, Asim, I've decided we're going to use cloth nappies. And I was like, oh, yes. So yeah, we're pretty green family. Like we recycle. Like you'll see me like carrying out around a plastic bottle all the time. We kind of do what I thought was the things we thought we had to do. And so yeah, all these disposable nappies did give me a pause for a second. So I was pretty happy to go with a cloth nappy. Now, through the miracles of the situation we're in right now, I can actually show you what a cloth nappy looks like. So I want to show you so you don't have this image in your head of a crazy cloth nappy. But it's actually pretty advanced. It's one of these things. They clip on. We actually have these kind of bamboo inserts so you can take the mess away. But it's not like a disposable nappy. With a disposable nappy, you just tie up and you chuck it away as quickly as possible. With a cloth nappy, you need to deal with shit. Okay. And he shits 8 times a day. So I was dealing with shit 8 times a day. And the thing is, you get quite used to it, actually. You get quite used to shit. Like it's all over yourself. You can see it. Sometimes I'll be in meetings and people say, What's that? What's that on your face, Asim? I'd be like, don't worry about it. It's just shit. So you get very used to dealing with shit all the time, 8 times a day. And then one day I just kind of realized, had this epiphany. Like I think I was in a team meeting. Um, I remember I realized at that moment that I was willing to deal with shit 8 times a day for the environment. 8 times a day. But not once had I ever put my hand up in a scrum meeting or an architectural discussion and asked, what's the greener option? Right? Not once. Like we'd sit and argue all the time about, well, hang on, which architecture is the cheapest? Which architecture gives you the best SEO? Which architecture has the fewest bugs? We'd argue insane amounts for this. Oh, the framework wars. Oh my God, you want tabs or spaces? Who gives a shit? Right? Argue insanely about that, but not once had I ever just asked in a meeting, well, what's the greener option? And that started me on a whole journey, which has now ended me up in a role at Microsoft called Green Cloud Advocacy. But I really started investigating and asking the question, well, what does it mean for a developer to be green? Like, what is a green application and how can developers build green, sustainable applications? And what I'm going to talk to you today is about that journey of me figuring out all of these questions, I suppose, first, and then the answers to those questions, and that my journey of figuring all of this stuff out. And I haven't figured it out. I've only figured a small, slim sliver of it out. So my first stop on this journey was an organization or a community, I should say, called Climate Action Tech. When I first got activated, and that's the word I used to describe it when you get activated into action. I asked around some people that I knew who were already activated, and they said, just go join climateaction.tech. Whatever you do, go join it. And what it is, the website doesn't do it justice. It's a huge, vibrant Slack community of tech professionals who care about climate and want to do something about it. And it's fantastic. You meet other people, like-minded people, and it's just a really great way of just feeling like you're part of something. And this is where I met other people who cared about answering the same questions that I cared about, and we all joined forces, and we all started asking the same questions and investigating the same, or trying to find solutions to those questions or answers to those questions. And where that led us to is something called the principles of sustainable software engineering. So the term sustainable software engineering is not a term that I coined. It's actually a term coined by people in the Mozilla Foundation. But what I would say is what we've done is we're the first people who ever kind of really condensed information down into a bite-sized and digestible format for what the principles of sustainable software engineering are. So, sustainable software engineering we describe as the emerging discipline at the intersection of climate science, software practices and architectures, electricity markets, you weren't expecting that, were you? Hardware and data center design. So, I used to think that full stack was front end to database, and now I know that full stack is user behavior to how electricity is bought and sold on the market, or really how concrete's made, right? And if you understand the breadth of this, you don't have to understand it in a super great depth, but if you just understand the breadth of this at some level, you can have a real meaningful impact on the climate, right? A real meaningful impact on the climate. And what the principles are, if you go to principles.green, are eight core competencies, eight principles, eight first principles of sustainable software engineering. I'm going to talk to you today, talk through those eight principles, right? The first one, carbon. So let's get on the same page. When I say green, I'm talking about climate change and the fact that the Earth is increasing in temperature. And the cause of this is greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases act as a blanket on the planet, warming it up. Now, it's a natural phenomenon. It's happened throughout the life of the Earth, but it's happened very, very slowly. Okay, the temperature slowly increased and slowly decreased. Imagine forests slowly migrating across continents. That's the kind of timescales at which we normally have that. That normally happens. But the problem right now is that we've pumped out so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and so fast, the temperatures are rising like that. And it's rising too fast for animals and plants and even human society to adapt to. Now, it's a lot more complex than that. And if you go to principles.green and the carbon principle, I'll actually detail it a little bit more. But that's basically, if you want to get on the same page, that's what I mean by green. Okay, I mean carbon. Okay, so there's lots of greenhouse gases I mentioned. The most common is carbon dioxide, and that's by far the most common in the atmosphere. But there's other ones. In fact, there's methane is another one. And the difference between methane and carbon dioxide is methane has about 40 to 80 times the warming effect of carbon dioxide. But it gets really complicated to talk about things like carbon dioxide and methane and all these other gases. So we normalize everything into something called carbon dioxide equivalent. And so what we say is 1 ton of methane is worth 40 tons of carbon. We normalize it all into carbon dioxide equivalent. In fact, we shorten it even further into just the word carbon. So when we use the word carbon, we actually mean all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. And the goal is something I call carbon efficiency. So I come from a position in that we're always going to be emitting carbon, always going to be emitting carbon. And the goal is about efficiency, it's about carbon efficiency. For every gram of carbon you are emitting into the atmosphere, make sure you're getting the maximum value you can get from that gram of carbon that you emitted. And really the situation right now is about we're just wasting carbon. That's why it's so sad, but it's also such a wonderful opportunity. We can get a large chunk of progress by just being efficient rather than wasteful. Okay, you don't have to change your lifestyle dramatically. In fact, you probably have an even better lifestyle and not be wasteful. A great example of this, I think, is car technology. So we've got internal combustion engine cars and we've got cars powered by electricity. And I think this is a great example of demonstrating the efficiency paradigm which I'm talking about. So let's take internal combustion engines to begin with, right? So they're powered by petrol, which comes from oil, right? But when we get oil from the ground, that's not the stuff you get in your car. You need to process it and burn some stuff and do other things. And you lose about 50% of the energy in the crude oil is lost through heat and other processes to turn into petrol. That's gasoline to my American friends over there. And then also at the same time, we need to convert that petrol, we need to actually get it to the car, we need to transport it, and then you lose more energy to get there. So you're down to about 40%. Then the car itself, we need to burn the petrol and somehow turn that into forward motion. And that's actually extremely inefficient in a car. Most internal combustion engines are only about 20% efficient at turning the energy from petrol into motion. So really we end up with about 8%, right? Terrible, right? 8% of the energy of oil is what actually pushes a car forward. Let's take a look at actually what it would look like for an electric vehicle powered by solar power. So like solar power, we consider it 100%. Okay, so the sunlight hits a solar panel. Okay, a solar panel might not convert 100% of the energy into electricity, but who cares? Because that sun was going to hit the ground anyway, and there's no, who cares? We call it 100%. To get that electricity to the car, it's actually pretty efficient. Pretty efficient. We lose about 1-2%. 3% if you transmit it in extremely long distances. So 2% is pretty conservative, I'd say. Then the car itself is about 70 to 80% efficient at turning electricity into forward motion. So there you go. That's a great example of the inefficiencies that we're talking about here. When we talk about being green, we talk about being when we talk about our carbon efficiency, we're just talking about not wasting carbon. And an electric vehicle is a great example of not wasting carbon. Even if the electricity came from burning oil, the electric vehicle would still be more efficient than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that leads us to the first principle, which is build applications that are carbon efficient. That is the core principle of being a sustainable software engineer, is carbon efficiency. Let's move on. Second principle is electricity. Now, when I first got activated in this space, I remember asking inside Microsoft, I said, I need to speak to somebody who knows about coding or software development and sustainability. And they said, speak to Connor Kelly. And I called this guy, he's in Ireland. I called him up. Like 5 minutes into this call, he was talking to me about electricity. I was like, okay, cool. Like 10 minutes in the call, he's still talking to me about electricity. I was like, okay, whatever, buddy. 30 minutes in, he's still talking to me about electricity. And now, like 6 months later, all I do is talk to people about electricity. I actually cannot believe I didn't know what I do now know about electricity. I can't believe I could be an engineer and not know about electricity. It's the thing, every single computer depends on it, right? Do you even know what it is? Like, what's the force? What is the actual force of electricity? And the thing is, we don't actually know. We don't know the force. All we know about electricity is how to make it and how to harness it. We don't even know what it is. Most of our society, all of our advancements, depends on a source of power no one actually understands. And if that's not magic, I don't know what is. But here's the other thing. When you use electricity, like your hands don't get dirty, it doesn't smell. Actually, it's one of the dirtiest things on the planet. That's because 49% of all the world's carbon pollution comes from the production of electricity. Electricity. That's because most of it is still produced through the burning of fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil. Mostly coal, like what you're seeing on the screen right now, like spewing dirty gases into the atmosphere. Okay, so now your brains are probably working. You're thinking, well, hang on, I know electricity. My computer uses electricity. If I build applications which are more efficient, maybe I can use less electricity. And yeah, that's true. But before you go off and rewrite everything in C and Rust, hold your horses. There's lower hanging fruit out there. But let's go forward and talk a little bit more about electricity. So the measure of electricity that we're going to talk about is something called kilowatt hour. Now a kilowatt is like a flow of electricity. It's actually equal to 100 joules per second. So a kilowatt means 100 joules per second. And a kilowatt hour means if you ran that for an hour, what's the volume of electricity that you get? And you're going to hear me use the word kilowatt hour quite a few times in this talk, so just something to remember. But even though electricity is a big part of the problem, it's also a massive part of the solution, a huge part of the solution, right? Do you know how much energy the world consumes? Okay, this one shocked me. It's 18 terawatts. That's energy, not electricity, energy. So a lot of that terawatt came from burning stuff and chucking it into the atmosphere and destroying our planet. 18 terawatts. Do you know how much energy is available from wind? 1,000 terawatts. Wow. Okay, so if we just harness 2% of wind power, we'd have enough energy for the world. Crazy, right? Clean wind power. How about solar? How about solar energy? 173,000 terawatts. That's how much is available right now if you use solar. That's almost 10,000 times the amount of energy the entire world uses right now from clean solar energy. To put it another way, 0.01 or 0.01% of all the energy in the world we can get from solar, from clean solar energy. If you have this, if same as me, I had this thought in my mind which was like, oh yeah, if only wind and solar, if only there was enough of it, or if only it was cheap enough, we could get. Wind and solar is already cheaper than coal, right? And there's so much more of it. This is possible, right? We just need to get the technology, the political will, a bunch of different things to roll it out at scale, right? But don't let yourself be stuck where I was, which is, oh, coal is really dirty, but at least it's cheap, so we need it. No, we don't. Sorry, ran over. So that's the second principle, which is build applications that are energy efficient. That's because that electricity had to burn fossil fuels right now to make it. Let's lead me to the third principle, okay, which is carbon intensity. So once I got into electricity, one of my friends, colleagues, workmates, buddies at Climate Action Tech suggested I listen to this podcast, the Energy Transition Show, and to this day, it's still the only podcast I've ever paid for. I pay for a podcast. Can you believe it? It's actually used as material, training material in universities right now, and it's one of the podcasts that's given me the most hope that there's potentially a light at the end of this tunnel. And it's taught me a lot of things, but it's taught me the concept of carbon intensity. So it's all about this transition that we're happening right now from fossil fuel to renewable energy sources. So there's a transition happening right now. If you're clever and you're on the right side of it, you'll realize we are accelerating very, very fast into renewables. And there's a bunch of people out there going, "Oh, it'll happen really slowly." All I think of is Uber overnight, right? That's the change that's going to happen. Hopefully, if we move into renewables, but the potential's there. All right, so I mentioned before, electricity is created through the burning of fossil fuels, and there's a measurement unit out there called carbon intensity measure, which is the grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. And this is kind of a measure of how much fossil fuel did you burn to get that kilowatt hour of electricity. And so the global average from last year was 519 grams, about half a kilo of carbon was emitted to get each kilowatt hour. You can actually imagine, if you imagined ash, coal ash in your hands, half a kilo, that's how much a kilowatt hour is, or by average over last year. But here's the thing, right? That's just the global average. It changes by a number of different things. It changes by region, okay? So in different parts of the world, you have different carbon intensities. And that's because you have some parts of the world have more coal power plants and some parts of the world have more renewable power sources. So different parts of the world have different carbon intensities. And in fact, there's a great website called Electricity Maps, which lets you look at it. So you can scan over, and I don't remember when I recorded this, but the US is about 310, 251. The UK at this time was 193. Must have been at night actually. Spain was doing pretty well. I think I went. Oh, Poland is 632. India 789, and Australia not doing too well, 774. So there's a bunch of different regions, and you can see now different regions have different carbon intensity, right? So it changes by regions. So running your workload in regions which have less carbon intensity is better for the environment. But it also varies on different things as well. It also varies by time. Okay, also varies by time. So let's take a look at this one. So we've got over time, so at the start, we've got some of our electricity is made through wind and solar, and some of it is made through coal and gas. So we maybe have like 120 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. Then the demand the demand stays the same, but over time, the wind and solar goes down because we can't control wind and solar. If the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, it's just going to go down. So what we do is we increase from coal and gas. There's no batteries in the network. It's just we just increase and decrease to meet supply and demand. And so basically the carbon intensity goes up. So over time, the carbon intensity goes up and down depending on if the wind's blowing or what renewables are available on the market right now. Right? So maybe if you could time your workloads to run when the carbon intensity is less, that's another option. So you can change to choose a region where the carbon intensity is less, or you can just change to a time when the carbon intensity is less. How do you figure this stuff out? How do you know when the carbon intensity is less or not less? There's a couple of different sources out there. There's a great source for the UK, which is fantastic, called carbonintensity.org.uk, which is 100% free, as a matter of fact. There's another company called WhatTime. I'm not sure I spelled that right now that I think about it. I don't think it's got three T's. I think it's just what. Oh, and it has three T's. Yes, it does. Sorry, my mistake. So WhatTime.org is a non-profit from America, but it does cost money to get access to their data. And the other one is the electricity map, which I showed you earlier on. They've got some really great services as well. So there's some great sources of carbon intensity electricity the carbon intensity of electricity that you can source from. All right, so carbon intensity, fantastic one. Consume electricity with the lowest carbon intensity. Great one. All right, embodied carbon. So I once gave a talk at a conference where I spoke about climate change. So a conference, I don't know, remember those? So a conference is like, it's kind of like this, but you meet face to face. I don't know, ask your parents. So anyway, afterwards, I usually get a few people to kind of ask me questions after I give a talk. And I remember one guy came up and said, great talk, but I just can't believe anything you said because you use a laptop and it was built in China. And it took me a second. That the China comment really threw me. But it turned out he was talking about the embodied carbon of my laptop. Basically, every time you build something, anything, any device, anything, you emitted some carbon in its production. The steel, the plastic, the electricity, whatever, it emitted some carbon. We call that the embodied carbon of a device or of a product. And so, yeah, my laptop, because I use a laptop which emitted carbon in its production, I apparently then couldn't talk about carbon. Anyway, the guy sat through my entire talk, fuming in disbelief at my arrogance, and waited patiently in a queue for ages to finally tell me he didn't believe me, and then left. Anyway, but what he's saying is true. Okay, there's this concept called embodied carbon. And the way to think about embodied carbon is, let's say you release 4 tons of carbon to create something. Now, we don't just ignore that. We don't just forget that happened. That isn't just something happened in the past. We do something called amortization. So let's just say we think that this thing, let's say it's a server, has like a 4-year lifespan. We spread out that carbon cost over the 4 years. And then we really say, well, actually, it's 1 ton a year. That's kind of the carbon cost, the embodied carbon cost of that server. Let's take a real world example. So a 2019 R640 Dell server, you can Google it, it has actually information on there. It has 1,280 kilograms of embodied carbon. And if you have imagined a 4-year lifespan for a server, it's usually 3 to 5 years. A 4-year lifetime for a server, that's 320 kilograms a year. You spread that over 4 years. And also they tell you kind of this is the energy consumption of this server, and then if we said it, like I took a number which kind of the EU, like an average carbon intensity in the EU for a year, and that ends up with 486 kilograms a year from electricity. And you add that together, that's 806 kilograms a year, the yearly total, that's the embodied carbon plus the electricity. So really, what I'm saying is the 40% of the yearly total is just the embodied carbon. So the carbon cost of a device is significant. Significant, right? You can't just ignore it. It's a real number. It's a real significant number. And that's for a server. A server uses a lot more electricity than normal. Your laptop, your phone, especially your mobile phone, most of the carbon cost of your mobile phone has already been spent because it's the carbon cost of its creation, not the carbon cost of its electricity consumption. So what are some things? How does that inform you about how to actually behave as a sustainable software engineer? Now, it can actually inform a couple of different areas. I think the thing it informs me is this one. I think the most interesting thing it informs me is this one, which is the lifetime, right? That server didn't die at 4 years. Servers these days will last indefinitely. They've got no mechanical parts, right? They got nothing. They will last a long, long, long time. We end of life servers because we think no one will want to buy that server anymore. It's too weak. It's too low powered. Everybody wants the newest, latest, greatest things. The best thing we can do is just lengthen the lifetime of a lot of these devices. If we just lengthened it by 1 year, if we took our example again, 1,280 kilograms of embodied carbon. If we spread it over 5 years, it's 256 kilograms. Electricity is the same, the yearly total is different, but really what that ends up with is that only 31% of the yearly total is the embodied carbon anymore. So just by lengthening the length of time a piece of hardware is useful for has a significant benefit. And that's on us, really. That's on us for constantly pushing the limits and being perhaps lazy with our development or lazy with our coding. Let's build our applications, right? So they run on older hardware. By doing that, we stop the pressure of constantly getting rid of our mobile phones, constantly getting rid of our servers. Just let your applications, let them run on older hardware. And that usually just means making them efficient. Okay, next principle, let's move on. Energy proportionality. So one of my biggest breakthroughs in understanding climate and the issues with climate and the scientific sides of the climate was understanding that it's just not linear. My mind just wants to think everything's linear. It's not linear, okay? Climate change is a story about things getting bad slowly, interspersed with moments of things getting bad very, very fast. And I think with COVID now, people realize how bad things can get very, very fast. And there's a lot of non-linearity in the mix when it comes to climate. It's such a complex system. Water is a great example. Okay, fantastic example. Water at -1 is solid. Okay, at 1 it's a liquid. That slight change in temperature is a big jump in the effect of water. The Amazon rainforest is another great example. To be a rainforest, you have to be a certain size. If you cut it just too small, it stops being a rainforest. That self-perpetuating action disappears. Then we lose a lot more. And I was really surprised to find out the same goes for computers. There's a concept in computing called energy proportionality, and I'll just explain it here. So what it is that how much electricity does an idle computer actually use? And there's something called static power draw. So no matter what, it will draw electricity. And in things like memory, like your memory in your computer, whether you're filling your memory completely or whether it's completely empty, it's still consuming the same amount of electricity. Networking is the same. Like your network card, whether you're transmitting like gigabytes a second or nothing, it's still consuming the same amount of electricity. The CPU kind of varies and other things vary, but essentially there's this thing called energy proportionality. So at 0% utilization as idle, let's just say, this is an example, let's just say it's consuming about 100 watts already because of all the static power draw. And in fact, the CPU the static power draw there is linked to the number of cores, okay? Each core has a static power draw, so the more cores you have on your CPU, and this is how we're going to go in the future, more and more cores, the more static power draw there is. But anyway, at 0%, we've got 100 watts. At 50%, we're consuming 180 watts, and 100% we're consuming the maximum of 200 watts, okay? So there's kind of this non-linearity, and it doesn't even cross the origin at zero. Ideally, what we would love to have is like a straight line from zero up. That's not how computers and servers work. So what does that tell us, right? If we had two servers or two devices and we use them both half as much or half utilized, we're going to be sucking up 360 watts of electricity. If we did all that same work on one server, we'd only be consuming 200 watts of electricity. That's energy proportionality. That's because of energy proportionality. We want to maximally use all of the resources, all the compute that we have, because they're just more efficient with electricity at the higher rates of utilization. So that's the next principle, which is like energy proportionality, which is run servers at a high rate of utilization. Okay, it's really important. Networking. Okay, so the internet is not just you and a server. There's a whole bunch of other switches and routers and servers and all kinds of different things in the middle of it. And all of them are consuming electricity. Okay, now some of them are going to be consuming like green electricity. Maybe they're in like a green area. But a whole bunch of them are probably just going to be using whatever the electricity is in that mix. And you saw from the map, there are some regions with some really bad electricity mixes. So unlike a data center, which is using one place, and they can do a bunch of different things to make sure they get the green energy, networking is usually a rubbish source of energy all the way through to the end, right? And so what does this mean for you? So we know that the kind of energy consumption from a networking perspective is related to the volume of data that you want to send and the distance it has to travel. So reducing the volume and the distance is an important thing to do if you're to be a sustainable software engineer. So to reduce the volume, make your APIs lean, transmit less data, and to reduce the distance, you use caching. Now think about what is caching? Caching is reducing the distance your data has to travel. And that sounds really familiar, right? And yeah, there's a lot of overlap between making applications green and sustainable and making applications cheaper, faster, and more resilient. Okay. So that's a networking principle, which is reduce the amount of data and distance it must travel across the network. That's the sixth principle. Okay. Seventh principle is something called demand shaping. Okay. So you might have got the idea when we talk about carbon intensity of kind of moving your workloads between different regions or different times. That's called demand shifting. Demand shaping is similar-ish, but instead of moving demand to different region or time, we shape our demand to meet the existing supply. So one perhaps good example is traffic on roads. I mean, we don't just go drive at the maximum speed and throw as many cars as we can on the road. No, we've got a limited resource. We shape the traffic to meet the resources that we have. Another great example in tech, I think, is video conferencing software. Probably this software that you're watching this recording on. So rather than streaming at the highest quality possible at all times, they often shape the demand. So by reducing the video, perhaps we often reduce the video quality and prioritize the audio quality, right? We shape the demand to meet supply. We can't make more bandwidth, so that's what we do. Another example is TCP/IP is a networking protocol, right? It's the actual way it works. Remember, when you download, it kind of ramps up the speed because it can detect that there's bandwidth available, and then it ramps down the speed because there's no bandwidth available. It shapes the demand based on the supply. And a third example, I think, is progressive enhancement with the web. So the web experience you have changes depending on the resources and bandwidth available to end user devices. We shape our demand. And you can implement it using a bunch of different, this is how I would implement it, which is basically you need to separate your workloads. okay, into components that can be scaled independently, video, audio, things like that. They need to prioritize the workloads, okay? And if supply is low, scale back the low priority work. This is how we need to start thinking about our applications, is what's the high priority features, what are the low priority features, scale back the low priority features when the supply is high. And supply you can consider here might be carbon intensity. If the carbon intensity, if you detect the carbon intensity is high, then you may choose to limit certain features of your application to just the essentials. You could also even implement demand shaping with user behavior nudges. Instead of forcing the user into one direction or another, just tell them, hey, look, right now it's not very good for the environment. The carbon intensity is high for your application. Do you want to choose this different path? Do you want to accept lower quality images? You can make these options to the user depending on context, depending on supply. So that's the seventh principle, which is demand shaping, which is instead of shaping supply to meet demand, try shaping demand to meet supply. 8, measurement. So nothing really happens in the developer space without measuring it. So how do we measure our application so we know where to focus effort? And how do we prove we had a positive impact when we did make changes? And I have to say I'm pretty sad. I don't think we've really got a good answer here for everybody yet. This is one of the weakest parts of the principles. I'm still not happy with it. I'm still need to figure out some really good answers for this one. But let me just go through what we have right now. So you could try and measure carbon. It's super complex. We don't know the carbon intensity. You don't know the energy usage. All the networking and everything that's involved is really, really opaque. Microsoft, in fact, we've got something called the sustainability calculator. So you can actually log on to Azure or cloud platform, and we'll actually tell you the carbon impact of just your cloud stuff. We're still the only cloud that have done anything like this, but it doesn't give you the information. We're still working on it. We still don't have the information at a granular enough level that a developer would go, oh, that's clearly where I need to put effort into. It's more of a report. But this is one of the things you could try and measure. See, and electricity is another one. You can try and measure electricity. There are a couple of tools out there. I've got them linked in the principles.green. But it depends, right? I just showed you before with the energy proportionality. If you ran, depending on what else is running on your computer, your energy consumption is going to vary, right? If your colleague on a different machine ran the same test, they're going to end up with a different electricity number, right? Because different machines consume different rates of electricity. VMs, virtual machines, make things even more complicated. It's super hard to measure. Cost. Most of the time, electricity is factored in, or in some way carbon is factored into cost. So building applications that are cheaper usually means have less impact on the environment, okay, which is usually a good argument to support this with your manager anyway. Networking, we covered it. Anything you can do that reduces the distance your data has to travel and the amount of data you send, we know that's going to have a positive impact on carbon, so you should definitely be focusing on that. And performance, but when I say performance, I'm going to be very, very clear. For the same number of resources and utilization, increasing the performance. If you just increase performance by adding 20 servers, you haven't reduced carbon. You're just spending more carbon and having more performance. Think about it from the perspective of, for the same resource, for the same utilization, have you increased performance? If you have, you've probably had a good impact on carbon. That's the last principle that we have right now, which is focus on end-to-end optimizations that increase the overall carbon efficiency. So there it is. There we have the 8 core principles of sustainable software engineering. This should give you an idea of what the principles contain, the breadth of the knowledge. You can go to principles.green and dig into, and there's a bit more information there. We've got carbon to build applications that are carbon efficient, electricity, build applications that are energy efficient, because energy, we release carbon to create the electricity. Consume electricity with the lowest carbon intensity. Not electricity is born equal. Some electricity is cleaner than other electricity. Embody carbon. Build applications that can run on older hardware so that hardware can be last longer. Run servers at a high rate of utilization, because you're just wasting it if you're running servers at a low rate of utilization. I forgot to mention, but there's a lot of this stuff's hidden and opaque. But the numbers seem to indicate the most non-Azure-y, non-Microsoft-y, Google-y, Amazon-y type clouds run at about 15 to 30% utilization. That's it, right? Most servers are idle. So this is a really important one. Networking, we've covered that. Demand shaping, try and change. It's super interesting. Demand shaping is super interesting. Try and change the behavior of your application depending on context so you can meet the existing supply, right? Rather than just demanding at the time when the carbon intensity is the worst that you roll up 20 servers. No, just try and shape it, right? Measurement and optimization, we covered them just now. All this stuff is pretty academic. How do we apply this stuff? And that's the next stage. We're working on parts of the website, where parts of documentation where we really start digging into how to apply these principles to all kinds of different things, different architectures, different components, different technologies. I'd love if somebody came along and said, well, let's look at MySQL. What is the greenest way to run MySQL? What's the greenest way to run Memcache? What's the greenest way to do whatever, like all these different techniques. That's what we're working on next. And so if you go to the website, you'll find it's just super loose. It's just kind of a bunch of recommendations for each different type of architecture, for each different type of technology. But that's the goal, is now to get the website and get the information to the point where we are really making it really applicable in terms of the knowledge that you can get. Which leads me to my big ask. Okay, this is the ask I've got for you. I'm not working on this alone, okay? And this needs a lot of people. We are kickstarting an entire discipline here, and we need your help, right? We've got the principles down, right? We need to. If you're an expert in something, you don't have to know the principles. But if you just want to get involved, come and get involved. Reach out to me. I mentioned You can find me on Twitter as Joake, or you can email me at askthem@principles.green. We need your help. We need your help to help apply the principles to all different kinds of use cases and come up with recommendations. Don't be scared. I'll be there. I'll walk you through it. If you just know something really well, but you don't know how to be green, come speak to me. We'll marry that knowledge together. We'll come up with some recommendations. I don't know everything. I don't know anything, if I'm honest with you. And I just need your help to flesh out the application of those principles. So please, please, please get involved and reach out to me. And my final plug and my final ask I'm going to do is I've actually launched a podcast called The Climate Fix. And in this podcast, I speak to academics, non-profits, startups, corporations, anyone working on a solution to the climate problem. Now, my creative there is to learn from these people who are actually having a meaningful impact, figure out how they're doing it, what's keeping them motivated, and how they're getting this stuff out to scale. There's a lot that we can learn from these people, and it gives me so much energy and hope listening to them and listening to how they're helping solve the climate problems that we have on the planet. Thank you very much for your time.